Today I sit down with the founder and president of the Pennsylvania Equality Project. Welcome everyone to Powered and Protected by Rainbows. I'm of course your host, Matt HASLAM. This past week I sat down with Mr. David Moore, who is the founder and president of the Pennsylvania Equality Project. So firstly, I want to thank Mr. Moore for taking time out of his busy schedule to speak with me. Throughout this interview, we discussed his nonprofit research, elderly LGBTQ care, advice on how to come out to your parents, how to deal with homophobia or transphobia in your own family, how to stay safe as an LGBTQ member and escape a country where it's still illegal to be LGBTQ, how to use the proper pronouns when addressing someone, how to start a GSA club at your school, how to get involved with your community, and so much more. As our first expert to be a guest on our show, Mr. Moore has taught me so much, and I know that you'll learn a lot too, so pay close attention. But if you want to see us do more interviews like this in the future, be sure to like this episode, comment your LGBTQ-friendly thoughts or suggestions of who we should interview next, share this video with others, and consider supporting us on Patreon. But without further ado, here is Mr. David Moore.
So hi, I'm David Moore. My proper pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the president and founder of the Pennsylvania Equality Project. We established the organization back in 2011, and in 2014 we changed the name from Marriage Equality for Pennsylvania to what it's now known as the Pennsylvania Equality Project.
So when you first started it as the Marriage Equality Project, why did you start it, and what was your goal with that?
Back in 2011, Governor Cuomo in the state of New York was in the midst of signing legislation that would legalize marriage equality for same-sex couples for the state of New York. It was also presumed that marriages coming in from other countries and other states would also be honored. Pennsylvania didn't have marriage equality, and I felt that it was something that I could do for the community. Initially, I thought it would be nothing more than a few friends of mine on Facebook chatting with me, but it blossomed over the years and turned into an organization that's now a nonprofit.
And after marriage equality passed, and I believe 2014, correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yes, May of 2014.
Mm-hmm. When that passed, what motivated you to change it into the Pennsylvania Equality Project and keep fighting?
So, marriage equality was one very important component in the fight for civil rights, but it's not the only component. Right now in Pennsylvania, a number of legislative pieces are working their way through the Pennsylvania Senate and the Pennsylvania House. For example, the Fairness Act, sponsored by people like Representative Brian Sims. That particular piece of legislation would prohibit discrimination against the LGBT community in places such as employment, medical services, public accommodations, housing, credit, etc. Also, in Pennsylvania, it's perfectly legal to perform acts of conversion therapy. There's no statewide ban on that. So with Marriage Equality 1 in August of 2014, it only made sense to change the name from Marriage Equality for Pennsylvania to something broader, such as the Pennsylvania Equality Project.
Along with the PA Fairness Act, like what other pieces of legislation are you working for?
At this time, we're interested in getting a ban on conversion therapy, and legislation has been introduced in both chambers of the Pennsylvania legislature. We would also like to see that piece of legislation for transgender people that would ensure that their insurance rights are met. So in other words, if a transgender person shows up at a doctor's office to begin the necessary process of transitioning and reassigning one's gender, that not only is the surgery paid for, but the counseling and the medications are also covered under insurance programs.
And with all of this, I know one of the biggest pieces that I've at least seen is elderly, and that's something we don't really think about in our activism a lot of times. Is we always think about the young people growing up and trying to come out as their true gender or and match their expression with their identity and with coming out as gay, bisexual, or pansexual, or one of those. So can you talk about the elderly and what you've seen from that, and how we can help them?
Right. So in terms of the elders in Pennsylvania, we have noted that there's only one community in Philadelphia that has a elder care facility open for people over the age of 65.
Wow.
One facility in the entire state. And we believe that that is something that must change. In other words, current nursing homes and current residential facilities for elderly people need to either adjust and adapt to the influx of LGBT people, many of whom will be out among their peers, or we need to address this issue by developing our own elder care facilities across Pennsylvania.
Is that something that the PA Fairness Act or the Equality Act of the federal government, because I know that piece of legislation is up right now for HR 5, is that something that those pieces of legislation would cover for nursing homes and elderly care, or is that something that we need separately?
So that would be covered under the Pennsylvania Fairness Act, because the way that particular bill is written, it would cover housing regardless of situation. So it could be a private house, an apartment complex, or a residential facility intended for elderly people.
Okay. And I notice one of the major things that the Pennsylvania Equality Project does is surveys. And that's something, forgive me, but we haven't seen that years ago before it was legalized to be gay and come out as your true gender identity. So why is that data so important? And maybe what is the biggest thing you learned from the data that you received?
So let me back up one step. One of the reasons we started the surveys in the first place is that one of our primary goals is to open a community resource and drop-in center in Northwest Pennsylvania. The 13 counties in the northwest corner of Pennsylvania lack any such facility. At this time, children who are kicked out of their homes at age 17, or elders who are 75, 80 years old, who are forced out of their homes because their partners have died or their spouses have died, could find themselves in awkward battles. And so they need protection. In order to get that protection, one of the things that our organization will need is grant money. And the best way to secure that grant money is to back up our commentaries, back up our anecdotal evidence with survey data that we are extracting presently. So since last year, we've conducted a total of 4 surveys, one on discrimination, one an opinion survey, a needs assessment, and one on coming out. And we believe that perhaps the discrimination survey was the most powerful because it lasted the longest, and we extracted a lot of data from that. First of all, we know that children who are between the ages of 13 up to 24 often find themselves coming out more to their friends, their close friends, rather than to their parents. We found that elderly folk tend to come out to their children less often than they would to their coworkers. So we found these results to be rather interesting.
And how would you help those kids come out to their parents more often, and those elderly come out to their coworkers more often? How do you shift that, or do you even want to?
Well, for starters, it would be best if we had the support of Pennsylvania schools. We would need Pennsylvania educators to work with us and other organizations, just the Pennsylvania Congress, in order to clear for the classrooms that would address these issues. Bullying would need to stop within schools across Pennsylvania, and we would need to develop a system whereby when a student feels bullied, a student wants to come out but can't, that they have a safe space in order to do that within the school setting. Now, my student, if they are having done so yet, is fivefold. First step is to make sure that they're absolutely comfortable talking about sexual orientation or gender identity issues at all. My suggestion is to rehearse these in front of a mirror and say, for example, hey, nice to meet you. I happen to be gay. in front of a mirror so that they don't get any rejection. The second step I would take is to address with a very close friend or confidant that they know will not reject them. In doing so, they're again rehearsing or relaying their information, divulging their information to their parents. Third, I would make sure that they have some sort of plan for if things go poorly. So if their parents say, well, you're old enough, get out, pack up your gay bags and leave. In situations like that, children often find themselves in the streets. And those that are in the streets have a far likelier chance of turning towards drugs and alcohol, towards prostitution, and towards sex trafficking. And the number one way to cut down on that is to assure that they have a safety net to land on rather than just being left to the wolves. My fourth piece of advice is that they get their parents and their families together and they come out in one fell swoop. They just simply come out, tell their story, tell who they are, and if they get the backlash, rely back on number three. So if they have enough money set aside, even $30 or $40, get to the nearest welcoming church, get to the nearest GSA, get to the nearest library, police station, hospital, someplace where there's going to be a safe space and someone to listen to them. And the fifth step, if all goes well and their parents accept them and their siblings accept them, is to begin coming out little by little. So in other words, come out to their friends, come out to their more distant relatives, such as aunts and uncles, come out to their grandparents if they feel comfortable in doing so. The number one piece of advice I give to anyone who hasn't come out of the closet yet is to understand that their sexual orientation and gender identity are their business, and it's their business only to divulge that information to whom they choose.
So out of all of the research that you've done, I know one of the key pieces is that education. How do we get schools to finally start teaching LGBTQ education? And a lot of people say that, well, if you start teaching about Stonewall riots or anything in general about LGBTQ history, how does that translate to helping kids come out and helping that process?
So in our study, our needs assessment, we discovered that 90% of all respondents had not received LGBT comprehensive inclusive education in Pennsylvania. That's more than just health class or sex education. That goes into the English classroom, the history classroom, any other social studies program. For example, English teachers could select writings from various well-known gay authors, such as Gertrude Stein or Oscar Wilde. They could very easily assign papers or presentations that discuss LGBT issues or discuss contemporary politics with people such as Brian Sims or Malcolm Kenyatta, both serving in the Pennsylvania legislature. Maybe they want to do interviews with somebody who happens to be LGBT. Or perhaps they could watch videos sponsored by Pennsylvania Equality Project and powered by rainbows. That's one method, but there are others. So what I would encourage teachers and people who are writing curriculum for various districts across Pennsylvania is to not only use the resources that we provide, but turn to the resources provided by other national organizations, such as the Traveler Project or PFLAG. Pennsylvania Youth Congress has a number of pieces of material that they can provide, and they've run seminars across Pennsylvania that reach out to youth. In Erie, we happen to be very fortunate to have Tyler Titus serving on the Erie School Board, who has already conducted 3 summits gathering together students at what used to be Strong Vincent High School to address LGBT issues among youth. And I think programs like that and future conferences that will eventually happen across Pennsylvania are significant and the cornerstone of how we get through to teachers and get broader education in our schools. And finally, I would note that the Pennsylvania legislature has a bill in the House that would require Pennsylvania schools to offer comprehensive LGBT education. We're simply waiting on passage of that bill.
And if someone's sitting out there, I mean, we have viewers all across the world, actually, in countries which it is illegal to be gay. And this is their only way to, really express who they are, is watching a show. First off, what do you say to those people that may not be as fortunate to live in, even though we're still fighting for some of our rights here in Pennsylvania? What do you say to some of those people that are fighting for any basic rights of human life?
I'm glad you brought this up because I've dealt with exactly these issues over the last several years. Without going into too much detail, because their particular situations are rather precarious, I've worked with one young man who's now 27 years old. He's an educated oil worker in Libya, near Tripoli. Tripoli is in the midst of a civil war, and this particular war has ravaged the countryside. Anybody who's LGBT faces the risk of being hanged in the public square. So it's very, very precarious for them to come out. Now, this was not always the case in Libya. During the reign of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya had much more freedom. Libya had freedom of expression, had freedom of coming out, and LGBT life was not thriving because Libya is an Arabic and Muslim nation, but at least there were people who felt confident enough to be able to come out to their own families. So my particular friend over there has considered doing a number of things, such as fleeing to Tunisia or fleeing to Kenya. And those routes are incredibly dangerous. He's asked me to help him get a U.S. passport. Under the current presidential administration, it is impossible to get people to emigrate from Libya directly into the United States because they are one of the nations that has a ban on immigration. To them, I would tell them this: do everything in their power to reach out to the nations in Europe, begging for and seeking some measure of residency. If they're going to run the risk anyway of attempting to cross the Mediterranean and get to countries like Italy or to islands like Lampedusa, to not give up the fight. But above all else, if they're living in a precarious situation in countries like Chechnya or in Syria, I would encourage them to remain vigilant. We can reach out to them as best we can through internet programs like this, but they must remain vigilant at least until the United States has a change administration. Our neighbors to the north in Canada are not even bringing people in into their country. And those that they are coming in such small numbers that we're barely reaching the people that really need the help.
In any of these countries, including America, what is possibly the best way, especially in America, what is possibly the best way that someone that maybe feels really small and doesn't really know if all of these different programs are out there? I mean, certainly we have seen there are thousands of LGBTQ rights groups across America. And I know one of the things the Pennsylvania Equality Project is doing is trying to bring all those groups together. But if someone is out there that doesn't know they exist, all these groups exist, what's the best way for them to fight for these rights individually?
So there are a number of things they can do. The first thing I would suggest is attending pride events in their local communities or in the largest neighboring city. So for example, if you're living in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and there doesn't happen to be a pride event locally, go to places like Reading or Allentown or to Philadelphia and engage in activities there. I would encourage people to go online and look for information on LGBT civil rights groups. They'll find a plethora of information just by doing a basic Google search. And they can even run it so that it's tailored to their local area. If their youth find out whether their particular school happens to have a GSA program. If they don't, they need to understand that in order to form a gay-straight alliance or a gender sexuality alliance in a public school, it is necessary not only to have student support, but a faculty member must sign on as well. So they would have to have faculty support. And I find it best if they also have support from the administration. Now, I happen to have set up a GSA at a nearby high school. I was the founding member, the founding advisor. And I took our fight for our organization directly to the school board. We were approved by the principal of the school. We were approved by the school district superintendent. And then when our time came to appear before the school board, I stepped up to the mic and expressed, you do understand that based on Supreme Court precedent, it is illegal for school districts to reject one program but accept others. In other words, if they're going to offer any programs of any kind that are extracurricular, they must accept all programs that are extracurricular. LGBT civil rights organizations have just as much right of forming and organizing in schools as do, say, the Boy Scouts or a chess club after school.
Wow, I didn't even know that. That's really amazing to hear. Is that there is those protections out there to start a GSA. That's really incredible to hear for especially our audience who is particularly young and
Exactly.
needs that.
Incidentally, regarding the vote from the school board when I was starting it, the vote was 7 votes yes, 0 votes no, and 2 abstentions. And the abstentions came to me after the meeting and said they would have voted in support if only they didn't feel like they were being blindsided by the vote. I said, how could you be blindsided? You knew this was coming months ahead of time. You'd been forewarned by the superintendent. And they still stood by what they said.
So one of the things that our community always faces is hate crimes. I mean, it's horrible to hear, but just in Reading, PA the other day, one of the things on another interview last night that we did was that Reading, PA just had a hate crime of someone leaving propaganda and leaving a flyer on outside of their building to a hate group. And with those things, there is no real way to stop it from happening because it's just leaving propaganda. That's free speech, so on and so forth. But with the hate crime laws in Pennsylvania, they're like many other states where hate crime laws don't cover sexual orientation or gender identity. And so the protection comes from local ordinances then. So if someone lives in an area not covered by a local or state protection law like that, what does that process look like to get these local ordinances passed? Or what does it look like to get a state or a state law passed to protect these things?
So I can tell you about Pennsylvania. You're absolutely right. And up until 2003, Pennsylvania did include sexual orientation within its what we call ethnic intimidation law. So ethnic intimidation law is the same as hate crime. They have the exact same meaning. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania struck down that law in 2003 because at the time the law was passed, it had multiple components to it. In other words, it wasn't just a one-piece bill regarding hate crimes. It was attached to unrelated material. I believe it might have been agriculture or a Parks and Recreation bill that was pending. And when the comprehensive bill passed, that was part of it. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that that is unconstitutional. So on a technical note, the law was struck down. Now, in terms of getting ordinances passed, at the county level, it is necessary in Pennsylvania to make sure that your county is what is referred to as home rule. If it's not a home rule county, the county commissioners don't have the authority to come forward and establish a human rights commission or a human relations commission that can investigate such matters. They can pass the ordinance, but there wouldn't be any follow-up. There wouldn't be any teeth to it. In cities, cities that are considered home rule, or cities such as Erie or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, the law was established, the ordinances were established based on their ability to do such things, to create such commissions. So here in Erie County, we've had a hate crimes commission, a human relations commission, established since I want to say 1999. It's been a long time in its development, and it still exists today. Now, how do you go about getting this elsewhere beyond Pennsylvania? My advice would be to approach your local officials within your town or your county, and simultaneously approach your state representatives and state senators and demand that you be heard, demand that hate crimes law be passed. And if you get rejected, go back to the constituents within that area. Bring it up at town hall meetings. Bring it up at county-wide meetings when the county commissioners meet. Make noise about it. Write letters to the editors of newspapers. Believe it or not, people still do read newspapers, even if it is online. I had no idea. Call into radio talk shows. Get your voice heard. Show up at pride events and demand that you be heard. We recently, back in October of 2019, attended an event sponsored by Representative Dan Miller, just outside of Pittsburgh. And that was an LGBT gathering of organizations from all across southwestern Pennsylvania, and we were invited as a statewide organization. And we ended up talking with over 200 people that day, bringing out topics just like this. That's the kind of communication we need. That's the kind of facilitated communication that we can get if we can reach out to our state representatives and senators, whether in Pennsylvania or elsewhere.
One of the hardest things for people beyond hate crime laws of their town or their county is right at home. Honestly, a lot of our viewers out there deal with homophobic or transphobic parents, other siblings, or grandparents even. And what advice maybe is there for them to deal with that right at home? Maybe they're closeted, maybe they're already out, but how do they deal with that hate right at home?
My advice to those who are dealing with hate at home, especially during times such as the COVID-19 restrictions and quarantine, is to reach out via email to organizations such as PFLAG. Get their parents to come to understand that it is possible for them to not necessarily endorse their child's sexual orientation or gender identity, but to at least accept that it exists and accept that they're different. If they can't reach that common ground, it might very well be necessary to look to other friends or relatives and leave home. And I know that's a drastic step. I know that is difficult for many, but that's the route many people have to take to get away from the transphobia and the homophobia that's going on all across Pennsylvania.
Okay, and one of our viewers out there asked a question about pronouns. One of the things that they ask about is the combinations of pronouns that people can be addressed by nowadays. And one of the pieces of advice we always give is to always ask someone in the LGBTQ what pronouns they would like to be addressed by at pride events and such, because it's always better to ask than to get it wrong. But
right.
Some people are confused that are new to it of which ones do they choose and what do they all mean, because there's she and her, he and him, they and them, z and her, they and them, and v and ver. There's a lot, and sometimes that gets confusing.
Right. Essentially, your proper pronouns, the ones that you identify with, you get to choose. And it's always best, if you're uncertain what someone else's proper pronouns are, just ask the question. What pronouns do you go by? What pronouns should I use to properly address you? And expect an answer, whether it's they, them, he, him, z, zir. It doesn't matter. Whatever pronouns are given, those are the ones that you should stand by. Now, with that said, One of the concerns that our organization has regarding pronouns, it comes from the transgender and non-binary communities. Because quite often these folks, when their name appears in, say, a newspaper or on television as part of maybe an accident scene or, God forbid, a murder scene, quite often these folks are misgendered. They're dead named. They're given the wrong information is put out there. So, for example, in the recent death of Tony McDade, a trans man in Florida, Tony was frequently referred to in the press as she. But Tony had changed his pronouns to he, him years before. It was the family, his family, decided to change them back to she, her. And that went completely against his wishes. So it's important in situations like that corrections be sent to the editors of newspapers and to the journalists that work within radio and television stations, and remind them that proper pronouns are something that is their responsibility to check on.
And with the pronouns, I mean, a lot of people know what she and her mean, and he and him, and they and them for non-binary especially. I know a lot of non-binary people use they and them. But what do the other ones of Z and her and Zay and Zem and V and Ver mean? If you can quickly explain that.
My advice for those that are unsure is to refer back to a material from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, which I've cited in one of the presentations I've given, and we can post this link online. It explains in better detail what the pronouns are and how to properly use them.
How do you suggest for anyone that may not be able to be involved in their community because they might be in an area of the country or a country that doesn't really support it, how do they sign petitions, and how do they get involved online, especially in the United States? What kind of petitions are there, and how can people find those petitions?
Well, if those folks are located here in Pennsylvania, they can sign the petitions that we post on our Facebook page. Just simply look for Pennsylvania Equality Project as the Facebook page. You'll find us, and you'll see those petitions come up over and over again. You can also check out nationwide organizations such as the Human Rights Campaign, or the Trevor Project, or GLSEN, that's GLSEN. And you'll find a number of initiatives and petitions there that people can read and sign if they so choose. And some of these petitions are global. Furthermore, I would encourage folks to take part in surveys that are ongoing by various gay news organizations. These organizations, for example, had a survey last year with 45,000 people participating from 163 countries around the world. Those numbers are incredible. As far as participating here, take part in our National Opinion Survey. And that way they'll receive email information directly from us if they choose to leave us their email address. So those would be the ways I would use primarily to stay in touch. Our organization, Pennsylvania Equality Project, and this comment, by the way, is directed to Pennsylvanians and people from surrounding states, Ohio, New York, West Virginia, Maryland, etc. We need help with our organization. We need good leaders. We need people in various regions across Pennsylvania to step up and volunteer their time, doing things as simple as sharing our stories, sharing the material that we post on Facebook. Send us an email saying, hey, I'd like to write a blog piece and join us as a guest blogger. Maybe hold a social gathering. And by social gathering, I mean get a group of friends together, talk about the initiatives that we're running, the petitions that we have, our agenda in general, and bring those to the table at, say, a local coffee shop or restaurant. And finally, show up at community meetings, whether they be in Erie or Scranton or Allentown. Show up at your county council meetings. Show up at your city or borough council meetings. Let them know that you want pro-LGBT LGBT positive legislation and ordinances to be passed. It is very important that we keep in contact with our legislators all across Pennsylvania and in our neighboring states.
And one of the biggest things I want to highlight from this entire interview is the fact that the entire time you've emphasized this sense of teamwork of you want to have all the organizations come together. You've highlighted other organizations like Trevor Project and Human Rights Campaign and many others in this. And that's something that, to our audience out there, I mean, I just want to point that out because that's really important. We are a team in this, and sometimes that's overlooked, and it's not a competition. We're all working towards the same goal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that leads to one of the topics that we had talked about earlier this afternoon, and that is eventually, come 2021, we would like to bring together various organizations from across Western Pennsylvania in the Pittsburgh area and from Eastern Pennsylvania in an area to be determined, and hold a regional conference. Gather together speakers, gather together people from the community, teachers, social workers, physicians, nurses, anyone who would have any interest in learning more about the LGBT community to better serve their students or their patients or their clients, and get them to listen to the various speakers that we'd be able to provide them.
So if people want more information about your group's activism or have any questions for you, can people contact the Pennsylvania Equality Project directly and ask those questions?
Absolutely. There are two different ways to reach us, by email or by phone. By email, you can reach me personally at dmoore@paequality.com. We also have info, that's info, @paequality.com. Either one of those email addresses will get through to me, and then as necessary, I'll share that information with members of our board and our other executive officers.
So I want to thank you, Mr. David Moore, for allowing us to chat today and for being a part of this. Truly, you've been working at this for many, many years, and honestly, you've been getting great progress with getting the Pennsylvania equality for marriage passed, and plenty of other things. I mean, honestly, it is truly remarkable what you and the entire Pennsylvania Equality Project has done, and now I get to say I'm a part of that group. So thank you so much for all that you do, and for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And when I post it, I'll probably post it to our page and then share it right away to PEP page. But
sounds good.
Awesome. But all right, thank you so much. Oh my God. The background.
Oh, Meredith. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to include that now, right?
Well, you have to. You absolutely have to. That's our art director, by the way.
Watch Powered by Rainbows Season 3, only on MHP TV.